If you believe these stories must be remembered, subscribe to Echoes of Valor and help keep history alive.
By late 1943, the air war over Europe had devolved into a brutal arithmetic of death and diminishing returns. Allied air forces sent hundreds of heavy bombers into German skies, only to watch dozens fall in flames before they ever reached their targets. Ball-bearing plants, fuel depots, and aircraft factories remained intact, protected behind layers of flak, concrete, and deception. Each mission cost lives and machines the Allies could barely replace, and yet the results were often negligible. Factories resumed production within days, sometimes hours. Air crews understood the grim reality. Every flight was a gamble, and most were losing streaks. The enemy's defensive network had evolved faster than Allied tactics. Radar-directed flak, disciplined fighter patrols, and hardened infrastructure made conventional bombing a slow, grinding path to victory, if victory ever came. Commanders in Washington and London watched loss charts with growing panic. If something didn't change, the bomber offensive would bleed out long before Germany did. In dark, smoke-filled rooms at the highest levels of strategy, a radical idea began to take shape. An idea that blended desperation, ingenuity, and a cold willingness to gamble with human life. What if, instead of sending 10 men to deliver 10,000 pounds of explosives, they could send 1 man, or none? What if a bomber could hit a fortress without the need for a crew to die inside it? Military engineers proposed turning aging bombers into remote-controlled flying bombs. Vast airborne torpedoes stuffed with enough torpex to level anything built by human hands. The concept was as audacious as it was terrifying. Pilots would take off manually, climb to altitude, set course, then bail out over friendly territory. From that moment on, the aircraft would be flown by radio from a trailing mothership, which would guide it to its target and deliberately crash it into factories, bunkers, and submarine pens too strong for conventional bombs. It was a weapon that treated the aircraft as expendable, and the pilot as a temporary component, necessary only for the first few minutes of flight. To some, it sounded brilliant. To others, it was madness. But by late 1943, the Allies were out of time, and the war in the air demanded answers faster than technology could provide. The radical idea, codenamed Aphrodite, was approved. Whatever it took, the skies over Germany would be changed forever, even if it meant inventing a new kind of warfare that began with a man stepping into a cockpit knowing he wouldn't be there when the plane reached its target.
The transformation of the idea into machinery began not in secret laboratories filled with cutting-edge prototypes, but in drafty hangars full of tired aircraft whose glory days had passed. Rows of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 liberators, veterans of brutal missions over Bremen, Schweinfurt, and the Ruhr, were rolled in and stripped like carcasses destined for a new, violent purpose. Crews removed everything that made them bombers: self-sealing fuel tanks, turrets, armor plating, gun mounts, navigation tables, even the ballistic glass from the nose. What remained was a skeletal airframe, lighter, uglier, and infinitely more menacing. In place of crew stations, engineers packed thousands of pounds of torpex, a terrifying explosive with nearly twice the power of TNT. Enough to vaporize a bunker, collapse a submarine pen, or rip a steel-reinforced target into dust. The planes became more than bombers. They were airborne siege engines with no seats, no safety equipment, and no future beyond a single violent act. Each conversion was an act of controlled savagery, where engineers were ordered to think not like aviators, but like demolition experts. the aircraft ceased to be tools of precision bombing. They became weapons of obliteration. Yet this monstrous design was only half the problem. The other half, and the part that terrified everyone, was guiding these flying bombs remotely through hostile airspace. Technicians installed crude radio control systems, adapted from technology that barely worked on light aircraft, let alone four-engine bombers. Cameras were mounted in the cockpit, transmitting ghostly delayed images back to the mother plane, where a bombardier and pilot, staring at grainy screens, would attempt to fly a 30-ton aircraft into an exact structure miles away. The system was temperamental, lagging, and prone to interference. A single misaligned antenna, weather shift, or enemy jammer could send the bomber spiraling toward a forest, a town, or a friendly convoy. And yet, in spite of every technical flaw, the military pressed forward. They wrote procedures, trained crews, and rehearsed eject and control sequences with a determination bordering on obsession. Failure wasn't just likely, it was inevitable. But the logic of war was cruelly simple. If only one of these machines reached a hardened target, the gamble might justify all the wreckage along the way. Project Aphrodite wasn't just a new weapon. It was a brutal experiment in remote warfare, built on the belief that technology could replace flesh, even when the technology barely worked and the flesh still had to get the aircraft off the ground.
The call for volunteers went out quietly, without posters, speeches, or promises of glory. There were no medals attached to Project Aphrodite, no guarantees of recognition, and certainly no illusions about survival. Crews were told they were needed for a special mission, one that would shorten the war and save lives. What they weren't told, until they signed the papers, was that they would be flying aircraft deliberately packed with more explosives than any bomber had ever carried, then bailing out mid-flight over cold, unpredictable water with only a narrow margin of safety. The selection requirement was simple: experienced pilots and flight engineers with enough skill to coax crippled airframes into the air, and enough bravery, or desperation, to accept a job that made combat bombing feel like a routine delivery. Many of them were veterans of high-casualty campaigns, Schweinfurt survivors, Ploesti veterans, men who had seen entire squadrons erased in a single mission. They were already living with borrowed time, and some saw Aphrodite as a chance for redemption, closure, or meaning. Others simply didn't fit anywhere else. Every crew consisted of just two men, a pilot and a flight engineer. Their job was deceptively short: take off, climb to a safe altitude, verify systems, arm the explosive package, and jump. But in practice, everything about this procedure was hostile to survival. The planes, stripped of weight and armor, flew unpredictably. Engines backfired, instruments malfunctioned, and electrical failures could detonate the payload before anyone reached a parachute. And even if the bailout succeeded, the men faced another silent killer: the frigid waters of the English Channel. Aircraft might circle back and search for survivors, but only if enemy fighters or weather allowed. There were no escort vessels waiting, no safety nets, no second chances. Worst of all, the crews knew that technical failure before bailout meant death, instantaneous and absolute, a mid-air detonation so violent no body would ever be recovered. And yet men lined up. Not because they were fearless, but because fear had already shaped their lives, and they refused to let it dictate their final act. They didn't volunteer for glory. They volunteered because someone had to try, and because they believed that ending the war even a week earlier might justify the cost of their lives, even if no one ever learned their names.
The first missions of Project Aphrodite unfolded with a mixture of technical optimism and quiet dread. Engineers believed they had solved the core challenges of remote flight, convinced the system would respond to radio signals with precise, obedient control. In reality, the drones behaved less like aircraft and more like reckless projectiles barely kept in the air. The modified B-17s and B-24s, stripped of their armor and weighted with thousands of pounds of torpex, flew unpredictably, shaking violently, drifting off course, or refusing to respond to command inputs altogether. The mother planes tasked with guiding them often fought with delayed transmissions, static interference, or complete signal loss. Crews watched in horror as their former aircraft, now unmanned, unstable, and fully armed, spiraled toward the ocean or into uninhabited countryside, detonating in colossal blooms of fire that illuminated clouds and sea. A single malfunction turned a strategic mission into a fiery waste, and every failure was recorded as lost due to technical difficulties, an antiseptic phrase that masked catastrophe. The dangers extended well beyond equipment failure. The bailout procedure proved lethally unreliable. Jump altitude was low, the aircraft turbulent, and detonators armed. In several missions, pilots and engineers failed to clear the aircraft in time. Their chutes tangled, didn't deploy, or opened too late for survival. Bodies were recovered days later, if at all. On other flights, the explosives detonated prematurely, killing entire crews instantly and scattering fragments across miles. Yet, command pressed forward, convinced that the damage potential of a successful strike justified continued human risk. Reports labeled failures as acceptable losses, while privately officers admitted they had no solution to the deadly flaws. Engineers proposed refinements, but time, resources, and patience were running out. The grim reality settled over those who volunteered. They were part of a mission whose success rate hovered near zero, whose dangers multiplied with every attempted launch, and whose outcomes were measured not in targets destroyed, but in how many men died before command finally admitted defeat.
By the summer of 1944, Project Aphrodite had become a graveyard of ambition. A secret program sustained only by desperation and the belief that somewhere, hidden among the wreckage, existed the possibility of success. It was at this moment that Joseph P. Kennedy, Jr., the eldest son of one of America's most powerful political dynasties, entered the story. He was no ordinary volunteer, a decorated Navy pilot, fiercely competitive, charming, and widely expected to become a national political figure. His family envisioned him as the first Kennedy president, a war hero whose reputation, discipline, and ambition would propel him into the White House. But Kennedy himself grew restless. He had flown more missions than required, taken risks few others would consider, and now searched for something bigger, something that would define him. When he learned about Aphrodite, still cloaked in secrecy, he didn't hesitate. Commanders, eager to secure a high-profile success and bolster morale, saw his participation as both a propaganda tool and a potential breakthrough. Kennedy would lead the most ambitious mission yet, a remote-controlled B-24 turned flying bomb, packed with more than 20,000 pounds of explosives, aimed at a massive German V-3 supergun complex buried beneath the French countryside. The target was not just strategic, it was symbolic. Destroying it could save thousands of Allied lives and cripple a weapon designed to terrorize London from unprecedented distances. On August 12, 1944,
The operation began under clear skies, with Kennedy and his flight engineer, Wilfred Willey, at the controls. The aircraft had already been modified with a complex remote system, yet malfunctions during testing had been frequent and unexplained. Still faith, or perhaps stubbornness, outweighed caution. The flight plan was deceptively straightforward. Take off, climb, activate the autopilot, arm the explosives, and bail out over the English Channel. From there, a mothership would guide the bomber toward its target, turning Kennedy's plane into a 12-ton missile. But fate would intervene long before the objective came into view. Minutes after arming the explosives and before the crew could bail out, the aircraft detonated in midair. With a force so immense, it shattered windows across the countryside and shook villages miles away. No remains were recoverable. No final words recorded. The explosion was so violent that observers were unable to determine whether Kennedy and Willey had attempted to escape or were killed instantly when the detonator misfired. News of the tragedy was buried under layers of classification, sealed away to protect morale and to avoid revealing the scale of the failure. The military could not publicly mourn a death it could not explain, and certainly not admit that one of America's most promising sons had been sacrificed to an experiment that had already proven itself doomed. For the Kennedys, a family built on legacy, the loss was not only personal, it ripped open a future that had been mapped since birth, transferring destiny to a younger brother who had never asked for it, and whose life would forever carry the weight of a mission that ended before it ever began. The explosion that killed Joseph Kennedy Jr. and Wilfred Willey rippled outward faster than the military could react, but the official response was immediate: silence, classification, containment. Within hours, files were sealed, witnesses briefed, and reports rewritten. The narrative was not shaped by truth, but by necessity. A decorated naval officer, heir to a political dynasty, had just died in a secret program the government could not admit existed, certainly not one that appeared reckless, ineffective, and grotesquely wasteful. Commanders, stunned and ashamed, were trapped in contradiction. They needed Kennedy's death to remain hidden, yet they knew that concealing it would elevate suspicion, rumor, and guilt. The mission itself was never announced, the location never publicized, the cause never conclusively stated. Official cables described a catastrophic in-flight malfunction, a phrase that excused investigation while burying accountability. But inside military circles, the whispers spread with lethal clarity. A failure of engineering, a failure of oversight, and, worst of all, a failure of leadership. Kennedy had not died in battle. He had died in an experiment that had no victories to justify its sacrifices. The tragedy bled into the morale already fractured by years of failure. Pilots and engineers looked at one another differently, no longer united by duty, but connected by the awareness that they stood on a conveyor belt of death, fueled more by hope than science. For the Kennedy family, the grief was immediate, overwhelming, and strangely muted by secrecy. Joseph Sr., a man who had meticulously engineered his children's futures, was left staring into a void that no influence, wealth, or ambition could fill. Rose Kennedy retreated inward, unable to reconcile the grotesque irony of a son dying not as a hero in conventional combat, but as an unnamed casualty of a machine that exploded before it ever reached the enemy. The military offered medals, platitudes, and carefully sanitized explanations, while aggressively suppressing any detail that might suggest risk, negligence, or futility. They were protecting the war effort, but also themselves. Meanwhile, among those who had served with Kennedy, bitterness fermented into narrative. Aphrodite, already whispered about with anxiety, acquired a new label, spoken not in protest, but in exhausted resignation. A suicide mission disguised as progress. Pilots who had once volunteered out of patriotism now disappeared from rosters, feigning illness or requesting reassignment. Recruitment became a moral battlefield, not just a logistical one. Engineers, haunted by every redesign and failed test, questioned whether they were building weapons or tombs. And yet no investigation produced reform, because no reform could salvage the premise. Kennedy's death did not inspire improvement. It merely accelerated collapse. Project Aphrodite continued, not with renewed focus, but with a kind of fatal inertia, driven by people too ashamed to admit defeat and too afraid to acknowledge what they already knew, that the cost of innovation had surpassed its value, and the only victory left to claim was silence.
By late 1944, Project Aphrodite had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The program had been conceived as a revolutionary weapon, a remote-guided bomber powerful enough to eradicate targets too hardened for conventional strikes while sparing the lives of full bomber crews. Instead, it delivered a trail of disasters: malfunctioning control systems, failed detonations, mid-air explosions, and pilots who died not in combat, but in technical catastrophes. Each mission added statistical confirmation that the project's fundamental assumption was flawed. Radio control technology was primitive. Interference was constant. Timing mechanisms unreliable. Aerial stability unpredictable. The military had taken a promising idea and forced it into operational service years before the science could support it. No amount of courage, sacrifice, or optimism could compensate. Evaluations concluded that Aphrodite had destroyed fewer targets than conventional bombing, at dramatically higher human and material cost. After Kennedy's death, even its strongest supporters became silent or distant. There was no scandal, no dramatic public reckoning, just a suffocating administrative consensus that the experiment had failed. Funding evaporated, missions were quietly scrapped, and remaining aircraft were returned to standard service or dismantled on the tarmac. Official memos did not declare defeat. They simply stopped using the word Aphrodite. Yet the end of the project did not erase its influence. It mutated into legacy. Engineers who had worked on the program carried with them hard-earned knowledge, not about victory, but about the terrifying complexity of remote warfare. They had learned that unmanned aircraft could fly, transmit, receive, and execute commands. They had learned that a machine could be piloted without a human on board, and that such a machine could carry a payload larger than any conventional aircraft dared risk. The lessons did not vanish with the program's cancellation. They migrated into classified research programs focusing on guidance systems, telemetry, and autonomous control. In the post-war years, critics would describe Aphrodite as a grotesque failure, a reckless military indulgence that burned young men for data. But the men who studied its wreckage would describe something else: a prototype for weapons that could operate without pilots, think without emotion,
and strike without warning. Cruise missiles, remotely piloted aircraft, loitering munitions. These were the ideological heirs of a project born from desperation. The tragedy of Aphrodite was not that it accomplished nothing, but that it accomplished too much, too soon, at a cost too high to justify. The world would eventually adopt its vision, but not its blood price.
In the decades that followed the war, Project Aphrodite became an obscure footnote in military history, too embarrassing to celebrate, too consequential to ignore. Historians, engineers, and strategists returned to it with a clinical fascination, not to praise its results, but to understand how a program so disastrously ineffective could nevertheless alter the trajectory of modern warfare. The missions had failed tactically, but they had succeeded in illuminating an emerging truth: that aerial combat no longer required a pilot in the cockpit. Aphrodite demonstrated, at terrible cost, that a weapon could be guided remotely, detonated precisely, and delivered with minimal risk to trained airmen. It also revealed the immense engineering challenges inherent in such a concept: unreliable radio links, crude autopilot systems, and catastrophic failure modes that turned aircraft into airborne coffins. But its failures became technical data, and its tragedies became design guidelines. In military laboratories across the US and Europe, scientists began pursuing what Aphrodite had attempted chaotically: a reliable, unmanned, precision strike platform. They chased stability, autonomy, and controllability with a zeal that reflected the lessons paid for in blood. Technologies developed in the 1950s and 60s, inertial guidance, telemetry, computer-assisted flight, carried echoes of those experimental bombers that vanished over the channel in clouds of fire. Yet the legacy of Project Aphrodite extends beyond engineering. It shaped the ethics, psychology, and politics of remote warfare. The project confronted commanders with a profound moral question. If a mission no longer requires a pilot to fly into danger, does war become easier to wage or easier to abuse? The United States would spend the rest of the 20th century answering that question through the development of cruise missiles, drones, and remote-controlled strike platforms capable of killing from thousands of miles away. Each innovation carried a faint genetic marker of Aphrodite, not just in design, but in philosophy. War could now be fought from a distance by operators who risked no personal consequence. What began as a desperate wartime gamble evolved into a doctrine that reshaped global conflict. Today, drones circle above battlefields as standard instruments of power. Precision strikes eliminate targets with surgical detachment. Autonomous systems map, analyze, and kill. And somewhere beneath that technological triumph lies the memory of men who climbed into aircraft they knew they would never land, sacrificing themselves not for victory, but for possibility. The legacy of Project Aphrodite is not triumph or failure. It is the realization that progress in war often begins with experiments so reckless, so tragic, that they are forgotten almost as soon as they succeed.